Content warning. This episode contains discussion of racism, sexism, all kinds of isms, and tabletop role-playing games. Don't say I didn't warn you, because I just did. Professor Farnsworth has created something truly remarkable, a machine that presents a realistic simulation based on any hypothetical posed to it. The Planet Express crew decide this is a reasonable way to kill an afternoon, so they all gather around the what-if machine as it regales them with stories about what would happen if only things were different. First, Bender asks what would happen if he was 500 feet in height. The what-if machine paints a tale of a massive Bender constructed on a distant planet and sent through space to arrive on Earth, where he befriends a lonely Fry. The two have a wonderful time playing together, but due to Bender's sheer size, their fun and games result in the destruction of Central Park and the deaths of many. The military's weapons are useless against the giant robot, and in retribution, he begins to destroy the city. To combat the threat, the professor uses an enlarging ray on Zoidberg, turning him into an equally large monster, and the two do battle. Both are destroyed, and a tearful Fry mourns the loss of his friend. As the presentation ends, the others tease Leela about her level-headed and predictable personality, so she asks the what-if machine what would happen if she were more impulsive. Within the world of this simulation, the professor informs Leela that he has declared her his sole heir, due to her lack of impulsiveness. He discovers his critical error too late, as Leela immediately murders him on impulse. One by one, the rest of the crew discover the professor's fate, forcing Leela to kill them as well. Before long, only Fry remains, and the identity of the murderer is now obvious. To keep Fry quiet, Leela declares that she must now do something really impulsive, taking Fry to bed for a night of wild lovemaking as the simulation concludes. Last, Fry asks the what-if machine what would happen if he was never frozen and never came to the future. Thus, the machine returns us to New Year's Eve, 1999, the dawn of a new millennium. In this alternate history, when Fry falls backward out of his chair in the cryogenics lab, he narrowly misses falling into the freezer. A strange rift then appears in the air, through which he can see the rest of the Planet Express crew, who are at this point unfamiliar to him. The next day, Fry meets then Vice President Al Gore and his Vice Presidential Action Rangers, an elite team consisting of physicist Stephen Hawking, Star Trek actress Nichelle Nichols, creator of Dungeons & Dragons Ernest Gary Gygax, and chess-playing supercomputer Deep Blue. They explain that the rift Fry saw was a sign that space-time is beginning to tear itself apart on account of some divergence from the true timeline. They return to the cryogenics lab and Fry recounts what happened. After a brief false start, they determine that Fry was supposed to be frozen. They insist he enter the tube for the sake of the universe, but he refuses. All of existence then crumbles around Fry and the Vice Presidential Action Rangers, leaving them as the only survivors. With nothing better to do, they all decide to kill their now infinite free time by playing Dungeons & Dragons together. Of course, none of this really happened, and back in the year 3000 in the real world, the Planet Express crew go about their day, their lives now all the richer for knowing what might have been. Welcome to Space Podcast 3000, where the future is in the past. So today we've got, I guess you could call it Futurama's take on the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror concept.
Yeah, which I think this is a good way of doing it.
Painstakingly drawn in front of a live studio audience.
Which I love that joke because it's almost a throwback to that one from The Simpsons. It's like, is this episode going on the air live?
Yeah, so basically this episode is just a series of non-canonical shorts recasting the characters of different wild episodes, which, was pretty much what Treehouse of Horror did. Though, I guess, like, Treehouse of Horror is typically movie parodies, whereas this is just general what-if stories. I do appreciate, at least, that they attempted to differentiate it from the Simpsons version in that way.
Yeah, and they sort of have a framing narrative device.
Mm-hmm. The thing longer.
Yes.
It's just such a stupid idea. It's a stick.
I mean, there are, pointers that are shaped like hands already. So that's just taking that but reversing it structurally.
I know, but, like, this is just a pool cue attached to your index finger, like, right down to needing the freaking
Needing
assist
a bridge,
device. Yeah, just use a remote!
But then you're not using your own hand. What if you want to poke someone just from really far away? Socially distanced poking.
Yeah, there you go.
And just grab a long stick.
But then you're not. But then it's not your own finger.
Grab your +1 mace.
Yeah, new turn of phrase. Instead of "I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole," I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot thing longer.
Yeah.
So anyway, I love the What If machine. It is such a funny concept. Just the idea of the professor inventing this device of just like, it simulates anything you want. And the fact that he isn't constantly using this for his research is just inherently very funny to me.
Yeah, well, it's the very in character with him, where he's like, "This is my drawer where I keep various links of wire. Oh, but that's my intergalactic spaceship. But here's the other stuff that's really interesting."
True enough.
Yeah. But it's just really cool. It's something that would be cool to have in general. A what if machine.
It'd be a great party game.
Oh, absolutely.
See into another universe where something else happened.
So many, really infinite applications for that.
Yeah. It's literally just showing multiverse theory.
I suppose. Well, the question is it really looking into a parallel universe, or is it just simulating it? Because I think it's implied that it's just a simulation, yeah.
But it's simulating what it would be if it did exist.
Fair enough.
And it's just running heuristic calculations.
Yeah. So should we get started on these scenarios one at a time? Might as well start at the beginning with Bender's scenario, Terror at 500 feet.
Yeah. You have this big, you have the Iron Giant, basically, or...
Yeah, it's just an extended Iron Giant spoof until it turns into a kaiju fight at the end.
Kaiju fights are fun.
Yeah. There's a lot of really good audio jokes in this short, like the sound of Bender's flaming belch when he's turned on. You get the belching sound, and it's combined with Godzilla's roar, which it's really subtle, but I love that. And then, of course, as he's flying through space, you get the Iron Man riff.
Yeah, Iron Man, and then you have him playing Hanson, which is like the most cheery bubblegum pop you could hear. And they get crushed, and then the music instantly stops, which is like, oh, so it was diegetic.
Yeah, and there's also the reference to the honeycomb commercial. I'm a big robot, and I want a big cereal. That did make me chuckle, even if it was a really stupid joke.
It's been ages since I've seen a commercial for honeycomb.
And this was back in the 90s.
Yeah.
They had a lot of really good subversions in that segment, because it was like we need a guinea pig. You think they're going to test it on a literal guinea pig, but then they use the guinea pig to catch Zoidberg.
Yeah, and the kaiju fight is... Zoidberg grabbing a train and then using it like nunchucks, and all the people just flying out, followed by Bender just using a tube and pedestrians like a blowgun. That is dark.
He doesn't even have lungs. How does that work?
Same way he belches fire.
Air vents?
Belching fire could be a chemical reaction.
Well, if we're talking stuff that doesn't make sense, he dies by falling onto that needle spire through his chest. It's like, what vital organs does he have there? It's a cabinet.
Good question.
True. It's just the drama.
Who is the real 7 billion ton monster?
Honestly, I think my favorite joke in the whole segment is just when Bender picks up Shea Stadium and it has that sign, home of 1969 and 1986 world champion Mets. Just, I find it hilarious, the implication that they haven't won the World Series again in 1,000 years. And, I mean, no, they haven't won again since this episode aired. Just 980 more years to go.
Yeah.
Although, the Mets did move out of Shea Stadium in 2009, so... I mean, if this kept to the real world, it would be Citi Field instead.
Wait, so you're saying this show isn't completely accurate?
Maybe they moved back.
That's possible. Just, it's funny thinking of all the things that are a bit dated there in the timeline.
Guinea pig is actually eaten in some South American countries.
Doesn't surprise me.
That is horrifying. Thank you for telling me that.
I mean, it's not like, for here it's pets, but for that's where they're found in the wild. So there's just so many of them absolutely everywhere. It's like eating rabbit.
Yeah, eating rabbit, Hassenpfeffer.
I guess. I mean, I still don't like the idea of eating rabbit, because they're adorable babies who are kept as pets often, but,
Adorable things are also delicious things.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
I'd try it.
Like cows. Or pigs.
Yeah, well...
I was at a petting zoo yesterday, and I'd still eat ham.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Fry kind of deserved that duck bite. You don't feed ducks bread.
Yeah, bread is not good for ducks.
If you want to give them something, give them like frozen peas. That way it doesn't also muck up the water.
That duck was just a jerk, though.
Well, the thing is, ducks will eat bread, but there is no nutrition in it for them, so it really is bad for them to feed them bread. But yeah, ducks are kind of jerks.
Oh yeah, just waterfowl in general.
Oh god. So the house I grew up in, we had a pond in our backyard, and we got asshole geese all the time.
Yeah, geese are the real jerks.
Yeah, constantly. Like, that was part of why we got a dog. One of the reasons we got a dog was literally just to keep the geese out of our yard by, scaring them. And it worked, for a while. And then he got old. Couldn't really chase them anymore, and they realized that. But, yeah, geese really are dicks.
Yeah.
Next time on Untitled Geese Podcast.
Not as dangerous as swans can be, though.
I don't know. I've never actually seen a swan.
Their wing beats could break a person's arm if they decided to attack.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, they're strong motherfuckers. And they're very territorial.
Wow.
Moving on to segment 2.
Yes, Leela's scenario. Dial L for Leela.
Leela being a bit more impulsive.
Yep. The professor declaring Leela his heir as the entire inciting incident here, it just makes me ask, what happened to Q*bert in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, right. He literally shows up later in the scenario.
Right, yeah, he has that brief appearance in the final scene. So, how does this make any sense?
It could be the fact that he trusts Leela more than his actual clone. Which, I mean, if you look later in the series, it is kind of canon that Leela eventually becomes in charge of Planet Express. Which happens in several scenarios.
Or a temporary heir until Q*bert is old enough.
I mean, that could work, the executor of the estate, but, that's not what he says. He says heir, and he outright says at the beginning that he doesn't have an heir.
Yeah, you have one. I mean, it's a character for him to forget, but still, you have one.
It really is so bizarre. I mean, to be fair, it does lead to an extremely funny short. I really love this short. It's hilarious, but it is one of those things where you poke at it and it falls apart in 2 seconds.
Yeah. But still, we can see all the mierder.
I don't think it quite falls apart. You just kind of have to assume that he doesn't think Q*bert is worthy of being his heir, even though he cloned him specifically for that. So it's just one more of his failed attempts, failed experiments.
I guess.
And we have the first, official appearance of Scruffy by name.
Yeah, this was his first appearance with a speaking role in the show, and of course it's immediately lampshaded with Leela just going like, "I've never seen you before."
I never seen you before.
Yeah, we were like a season and a half in, and we're just now meeting Scruffy.
Well, he does his job well. You never notice him, and he cleans everything up.
Yeah, he's quiet and stays out of the way.
He's the miraculous cure that fixes everything at the end of the episode.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, sorry.
I think my favorite bit in this whole one is Hermes just coming in and saying, "Sweet giant anteater of Santa Anita," because I think this is the most forced that this catchphrase has ever been, and I enjoy the awkwardness of it.
Also, giant anteaters, how are they supposed to...
They eat giant ants.
Just giant anteaters as your killer animals is kind of a absurd idea in and of itself. I've seen killer pigs, I've seen killer lions, but killer anteaters that's just like the first one in the dictionary.
Sorry, I'm too busy imagining magical girl Scruffy right now.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
But yeah, giant anteaters. I mean, anteaters can seriously mess you up, but why make them man-eating? How would they be man-eating with how their faces are made?
I mean, if they're giant anteaters, how big are the ants?
That too.
Well, it's giant anteaters to eat giant ants.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this story. It's just really funny.
Just randomly killing people anytime they discover that. I do like there's a lot of really great visual gags, like with the sword, where she kills Q*bert and then she kills Scruffy on top of him. So like, did she have to take the sword out and then put it in him again? But then she kills Nibbler, which I was actually no, not Nibbler.
It's in the middle.
Then she kills Nibbler, who's like right in between the two.
Sandwiched between them.
It's a carnage sandwich.
Carnwich.
I kind of want a Carnwich now, just a big meaty... Would that be like a Sloppy Joe?
Maybe.
Loose meat sandwich.
Yeah. Make a Carnwich to promote the new Venom movie.
There you go.
I could see them doing that.
Covered with like hot sauce and something like red and gooey.
I'd eat that.
Anyway, what do you think Fry sees that gets him screaming?
I don't think he sees anything. I think it was he feels.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's them sleeping together, you know?
Fry gets pegged.
I could see I could see Leela doing that.
I'm sorry. We don't have to put that in, but...
I mean, we're all adults here.
Though we don't know for sure if our audience is.
I mean, anyone watching a Futurama podcast probably is not, 5 years old.
Hopefully not. I'd be concerned if they were.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Spoiler alert, Santa isn't real.
So, let's move on to Fry's scenario. The unfreeze of a lifetime.
I'm honestly a little disappointed by this one because it's such, an interesting scenario that they could have followed it with, but I guess it's something that would need its own episode if it were taken seriously.
Yeah, they absolutely would have needed their own kind of thing, because they wanted something that I guess could be wrapped up in 7 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty, one of the movies spends a decent chunk of its runtime just showing what if Fry went back to the 20th century and, lived out the rest of his life there. That's the whole thing in one of the movies, and yeah, it does take a while because there's a lot to go through. But really, we need to address the elephant in the room here. All of this episode's celebrity cameos are somewhat uncomfortable in retrospect.
Yeah.
Stephen Hawking passed away a couple years ago, and he's still greatly respected as a scientist, but his social and especially his anti-capitalist advocacy continues to be completely ignored by pretty much everyone. And I have a feeling you might not have even known that he was an anti-capitalist advocate.
I feel like I've heard it before, but yeah, it's not something you really hear about.
It's like Helen Keller, who is just reduced to this disability inspiration porn, and oh, she learned to talk, and everyone ignores the things that she actually had to say. And it's the same with Hawking. If it's not about physics, no one wants to hear it. And it's just I hate when people do this, because it reduces these people from actual three-dimensional, fully realized human beings and makes them into cardboard cutouts.
Mm-hmm.
It's what's the term? It's the Marilyn Monroe effect, where they are more an icon than an actual person.
Yeah. Hawking had a lot to say, and a lot of it, he was a very intelligent person. A lot of what he had to say was really intelligent, but no one wanted to listen. I need to find the exact quote, but there was a thing he was talking about how his biggest concern for the future has nothing to do with science, but is inequality. And how, we have the technology and the resources to, take care of people, and how automation and such is inevitable. And what happens will just be determined by how things are distributed and how we want to deal with inequality. Yeah. This was something he was really concerned about. This was, his number one concern for the future. And no one cares.
Yeah, especially as, someone who was disabled. I mean, you and you have autism, I'm ADHD, we're disabled as well. Certainly not in the same way, but we do still deal with a lot of the same issues when it comes to getting help.
Yeah, I'm glad Hawking was able to get, what he needed with the voice synthesizer, the wheelchair, and everything, that he was able to be as successful as he was. It really does frustrate me because, yeah, it is part of this where people just didn't want to listen to what he had to say. I know I keep repeating myself, but this was kind of a big thing that I care about deeply. And I have a feeling that part of it is just that people wanted him to be this inspirational disability porn. He overcame all of this adversity to become one of our greatest physicists. Let's just ignore everything else about his life.
And then they just end the story there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that happens a lot, unfortunately. There's so much disability porn out there. It's horrendous.
I mean, I mentioned Helen Keller earlier, and the entire story tends to center around that one teacher rather than, Helen herself, because Helen had the unmitigated gall to use her newfound ability to speak and communicate to become a socialist. And everyone just wants to bury that aspect of her life. Anyway, I don't want to spend the entire rest of the episode talking about this, because there were other celebrity cameos that are also uncomfortable for different reasons, like Al Gore.
They really kind of did try to turn Al Gore into a likable punchline with a lot of this Fox stuff.
Yeah, I think actually this was Al Gore's first appearance in a television show, outside of, direct politics stuff. And amusingly, when this episode re-aired during the 2000 election, from what I've read, apparently it was advertised as starring a guy who is kind of, sort of our next president, maybe. If only. I want to live in that timeline.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's use the what-if machine on the...
Yeah. What if Al Gore had been elected president in 2000? I mean, maybe I should have worded that better, because he, as I've said before, he won the election. It was the freaking lawsuit.
What if he was instated as president? Is that the term?
Yeah, what if Al Gore was declared president in 2000? What would our world now look like? Probably better, let's be honest.
Yeah. And then there's Gygax.
Gary Gygax.
Oh, I want to save him to the end, because I have a lot to cover there. If that's all right with you guys.
All right, that's fair.
Okay, then Nichelle Nichols.
Yeah, oh god, Nichelle Nichols. I really feel for her these days. This poor woman. Just suffering from dementia and currently having this whole battle over her conservatorship. Like, there's claims that she is being exploited, similarly to Britney Spears with forced convention appearances and the like.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, except it's even worse because Nichols is suffering from dementia.
Yeah. Even more, disability and being exploited.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's really just allegations. We don't know for sure exactly what's happening because this whole legal battle is still ongoing. But it is like, these claims are horrifying. Just taking advantage of this, woman suffering from dementia to make money off of convention appearances and such.
I really hope they're just claims.
And with the implication, of course, is that they're doing this while they still can.
Yeah.
Because they know the end times is approaching, so they need to get as much out of this one celebrity as they can, which is just, and that's capitalism in action. I think we're 29 for 29 now.
Ugh.
And really, she just could use rest.
I really didn't know a lot of these things going on with each of these particular celebrities watching this episode, so I just never looked into it. But so, like, the episode was hit very differently for me. So these are just fun with celebrity cameos.
Yeah, it's mostly the stuff that's happened or come out in the years since this first aired.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's more definitely retrospective.
Yeah, I think the only one who's still fine is Deep Blue, as far as I know. Maybe he was involved in an electricity doping scandal or something in the past few years. I don't really pay attention to chess.
Excuse me? I'm pretty sure they referred to Deep Blue as a she.
I don't know.
Deep Blue has no gender, only chess.
Understandable.
Deep Blue's two genders are black and white.
There's a quote from the Twitter user, I think it's pronounced Foon or FO1, I'm not sure. I follow them on Twitter, and they had this one great quote. My gender identity is no on a good day and fuck no on a bad day. And I feel like maybe that applies to Deep Blue. I mean, I don't know.
What is gender? Can I checkmate it?
I don't know. I've never spoken to Deep Blue, so I can't say how they feel about this. Anyway, yeah. So let's circle back to Gary Gygax. This is gonna take a while because I have a lot to say about Gary Gygax.
Should I start a timer?
I think that's a bit unnecessary, but for starters, he and Dave Arneson didn't even really invent Dungeons and Dragons. For the most part, they just codified and wrote down a game that had been sort of collectively and collaboratively built over many years by many gaming groups across the Midwest.
You mean Chainmail?
Chainmail and variants of it, and they basically just took all of these different gaming traditions that different groups had been sort of informally building, and all they did was just, write down and unify and codify a single rules set.
They just trademarked it.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing, I will say, because that happens a lot. Like with sports, they have all kinds of different, when things start getting developed with sports, there has to be one person to kind of, okay, let's kind of officialize the rules, figure out exactly what works. And because you see that with the development of all kinds of different things, they had 9-pin bowling and 10-pin bowling, which are slightly different variants of each other, and you just adapt the rules. But usually, it's not attributed to a single person that writes down and officializes all these rules.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad thing that they codified the game as a single thing, and there is a lot of value in that. It's a lot of work. But my point is just that they get, and Gygax especially, get the credit for creating the game when they really didn't. And then, you follow this up with...
It was a community effort.
Yeah, after they made the game, the history of their company, TSR, was defined pretty much exclusively by an almost comical level of mismanagement. And then by the time the game started getting popular in, the past few years, Gygax had nothing to do with it for decades by that point. Like, as Talon Lee put it in this one really good YouTube video about the subject, holding up Gygax as this important creative is the gamer equivalent of a great man theory of history. It's just wrong.
Which it could be said for a lot of creators, for a lot of things. That's your auteur theory, butting up against auteur theory.
Yeah, God, I can't remember the details, but I once saw a very funny article in the gaming press where it was like a quote from this one auteur talking about how making a game is a collaborative thing with hundreds of people working on it, and you can't really credit it to one specific person. And like the article had this quote followed by says the creator of blah blah blah. That is just perfect unintentional satire.
Yeah, I mean, someone has to be, the brains behind something. But, you should also credit all the other hard work that goes into something.
Right. No man is an island, and no one creates a huge work like this alone. Also, circling back to Gygax, dude was just turbo racist and extremely sexist, because of course those two things tend to come as a package deal, and overall just not a very good dude. Like, you look at his history of internet forum posts, and you can see all of this blatantly on display.
Well, clearly he used charisma as his dump stat.
Well, like, okay, for instance, he claimed that girls' brains aren't wired for RPGs because every girl he ever played with ended up leaving.
Yeah, that's
why. Yeah,
dude,
dude, sure, there's no way it's because you made them uncomfortable, It's just because it must just be their brains.
In my experience, like, this, not speaking from personal experience of playing games, but just like what we were learning in game development courses, this is not, of course, I'll preface this by saying this is not a perfect all cases scenario, but girls tend to prefer games with more role-playing opportunities or more story building or world building opportunities, things like The Sims, Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing, so if anything, girls would be more into a game like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and TTRPGs have a ton of options. Dungeons and Dragons can tend to be a lot more combat
It can be,
focused.
well, that's if you play it that way, but like Dungeons and Dragons really is kind of the de facto default for a lot of these things, just because it is so ubiquitous, just because it is so easy to get resources for it. But yeah, there are plenty of games that are very, if you're doing it for combat, you're kind of doing it wrong.
Well, like what Eden said, D&D is very much designed for combat. Like, you break down any of its source books, and the lion's share of the page count will be dedicated exclusively to combat and combat-related things. It's very clear that that's where the design focus was and still is, and that this is the expected mode of play. Like, you can feasibly use it to do other things, but this is the assumption that it was designed for.
Is fairly true, because it was originally adapted from a tabletop war game. So obviously combat would be the focus. I mean, I believe the wizards were initially ballista. So, yeah.
Well, like, that's beside the point. There's still way more that we need to cover. Like we talked about the sexism. We have not even touched the ridiculous racism of this dude yet. Like, I think there's a lot of things I could point to, but the most galling incident for me is when he was on a web forum. Gygax was trying to defend the idea of a lawful good character committing genocide against monsters. Like, he was literally trying to argue that, like, yes, killing hundreds of, like, these monsters is, can be a lawful good action. And while defending this, he used the phrase, and I quote, "nits make lice." This is a quote from Pastor John Chivington, who, when he said this, was talking about killing Native American children. I am not even remotely kidding. Gary Gygax quoted a man who said it was okay to murder Native American children just for being Native American in order to justify killing monsters as a lawful good action. I wish I was making that up.
Again, that's a problem with the
So
alignment
many other
concept
metaphors.
in D&D, which is always one of the most hotly debated concepts, because the person who said this quote probably saw himself as lawful good.
I mean, I think you're missing the forest for the trees here, but
No,
sure.
I'm not missing the forest for the trees. I'm just saying that this whole thing is bigger problem than a forest.
I mean, okay, but you know what you said. Let's talk about alignment for a second. On the subject of alignment and the way it's presented in Dungeons & Dragons, the very concept of good and evil being an objective scale based on divine bullshit is very evangelical Christian, which very much tracks since that's what Gygax was, which is why D&D getting wrapped up in the 80s satanic panic was so ironic.
And then, of course, they ended up with a D&D splat book where you can actually do adventures in Old Testament biblical times.
And, like, with alignment, the racism was codified into this as well, because there was, like, no part of this game that it didn't touch. Like, racial alignment being the main thing. Like, certain types of monsters being evil by default. Or even, like, I remember as far as late as 3.5, which is the edition that I started playing with, where, like, there were literally playable races where it was like, this race can never be good, or this race can never be lawful, and just because of their race. And, like, again, you have this assumption of certain types of monsters being evil by default because of racial alignment, and that is a pretty fucking racist assumption, because it automatically frames any interaction that isn't killing these monsters as bad. And you can see how harmful this kind of thinking is, right? Like, not even just when applied to the game, but when you extrapolate this. Like, just the kind of person who would think to write something like this, who would have this idea of certain species of things being, like, genetically evil, and that the only moral course of action is to kill them. You see the problem here, right?
I'm seeing that you can definitely interpret it in some pretty bad ways.
I don't know how else you're supposed to interpret this.
Here's a way I can sort of interpret this, that they need some sort of cannon fodder enemy if it is going to be a combative game. You have to have some sort of creature that they're going to fight that they don't feel bad about. So you do end up having this sort of, these are evil, don't feel bad about killing them, they're just obstacles in your way to get your character more experience. The problem is when people start trying to apply that to real world concepts, is like, well, if these people are just an obstacle in my way, then I should not feel bad about destroying them. It's like, no, these people that you're talking about killing are not fictional. You're trying to apply a video game concept to a video game or a game concept to real world politics, which does not work. That's the problem when there's a difference between real life and games.
The problem is it can also apply to more than just people, like, how much people hate wasps or bugs in general, while they still perform a very important ecological need.
That's a good point, but I do want to address what you said, TZ, there about, the being cannon fodder. There are so many better ways to justify that. Like, let's say there's a tribe of goblins living, near this human village, and the goblins, are coming in and raiding the human village and killing people and stealing supplies. Now, there's two ways you could frame this. You could frame this as these goblins are doing evil things. They're hurting people. They're stealing stuff. You need to go fight them and get rid of them and maybe kill them if necessary because that's justified self-defense. That's an okay thing to say in a game. Like, that, perfectly fine, because you are judging these goblins by the things and the evil they are doing.
Of course.
However, the way it's framed in Dungeons & Dragons is the goblins are evil because they are goblins. They are racially, genetically evil. And it has nothing to do with what they're doing. It is just what they are. And therefore, killing them is justified, not because of what they're doing, but because of what they are. This is what I am talking about and what is such a problem. It's the framing. It goes beyond just the mechanics. Like, you can try to justify this however you want. That doesn't change the fact that this framing is inherently problematic.
Of course.
And this isn't even getting into, like, the player-facing side of this, like racial stat modifiers, which are flagrantly eugenicist. Like, the idea that some races are inherently stronger or smarter than others is literally eugenics.
Well, I suppose there's a bit more of a justification in Dungeons and Dragons where they literally are different species.
I get that, but the implications remain, especially when you get into things like into more social-facing stats, like intelligence or wisdom or charisma.
That kind of thing, definitely.
I do appreciate how a lot of the writers on newer editions of D&D have been trying to address this and make the game more open to diversity with things like the talk.
Yes, that is a very important thing to state, that this was done as, of course, this was first edition. It's obviously a sloppy game. You couldn't have, in the very first version of D&D, there was just an elf, and that was both the race and the class. Same with the dwarf or the halfling. That was literally your class was halfling.
Yeah, very much pigeonholing. But like even in later editions where they, decoupled race and class, they still had these things like racial stat modifiers, racial alignment. Those are still relatively recent parts of the game. And again, I do really like how newer writers are trying to deal with this and make it better. Things like Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, supplement for 5th edition, that decouples race from stat modifiers and provides alternate origin points to try to, do away with these implications. Like, I'm not saying D&D is a bad game or anything. I have enjoyed it plenty myself over the years. But you do see how so much of the racism of the man behind it is baked into the game's very foundation in ways that are extremely difficult to completely remove from it. Like, even the idea of adventurers as these paragons of humanity and allied races delving into monster-filled dungeons to claim treasure, wealth, glory for themselves is a very strongly libertarian fantasy. Like, this is why we say that all art is political, because even if the creator of a work of art doesn't intend to make any kind of political message, what they create will inevitably be shaped by their personal views and assumptions around the world, about the world.
Either their personal views or the views of people that experience that piece of art. So the fact that people are taking this thing and going in a different way is almost a testament to what he managed to do. So I feel like a lot of things that become extremely popular don't do it just because the thing itself is a great piece of art. It's because it fills a hole that needed to be filled. Because we needed sort of an outlet like this sort of thing for this sort of regular structured storytelling aspect. Because kids do this thing all the time. They do Let's Pretend, that's basically what Dungeons and Dragons is, or to use any sort of tabletop role playing, it's a regulated version of Let's Pretend with actual stats, and it's like, can you do this? This is how you do this. So I feel like this thing sort of fills a niche that was required, that like the world needed this sort of a thing to exist, and then whatever the world does with it is up to the people that get into it, that sort of thing.
But it shouldn't be held up as, this singular pillar that is this shining example for tabletop role-playing games. There are so many other options that don't use D&D as a base at all.
There's tons. There's you can like Pathfinder. Well, Pathfinder is very similar to D&D, but you have like Ironclaw, you have World of Darkness, you have Call of Cthulhu. You even have a lot smaller ones. You have like Eclipse Phase, other things. You have any kind of Roll20 system, which again was D&D. But you're seeing just how ubiquitous D&D was, just because the company that made it was kind of got in right at the beginning and kind of created essentially this genre, that there were so many that were born out of just the idea, even if it doesn't use D&D as a basis.
But it still shouldn't be held to the golden standard that it is.
Yeah, I have a feeling that the reason 5th edition D&D is as popular as it is, and is, the edition that exploded the game to its current monumental size, I think that has less to do with the edition itself and more to do with a case of extremely fortuitous timing. Because when 5th edition launched, it was just when the idea of actual play podcasts, podcasts where you're basically listening in on a game of Dungeons and Dragons or some other tabletop RPG, that was really just getting started. Like, it was a brand new thing, filling this niche in the market that no one even knew existed. So you had stuff like the Adventure Zone and Critical Role. And they were starting basically right before the launch of 5th edition D&D, and so they were getting early access to it because these were people who already had big audiences from other stuff, and so they were basically introducing the world to this new version of D&D to all of their listeners who weren't really familiar with tabletop RPGs but were listening to these podcasts and really enjoying them, and wanted to try playing what they were seeing on these podcasts. So they would pick up D&D and start playing it. And, it's almost a meme at this point among people who play tabletop RPGs that D&D players are reluctant to try anything else, and they just insist on hacking D&D into whatever variant setting or storytelling that they want to do rather than try something purpose-built for that.
Just crying over her not being able to find enough players for things that aren't D&D.
That's a huge problem too, yeah. But there's that. There's also, around the same time, you had stuff like Stranger Things, an extremely popular television show where the main characters play Dungeons and Dragons. And, that's also extremely good publicity. And it was really just these factors outside of the game itself that I think really caused D&D 5th edition to explode so much. Personally, I miss 4th edition because, as flawed as that one was, it was at least honest about what D&D always is and has been, primarily a vehicle for combat. That, it understood that was always where the design focus was, and so it put all of its focus there. Rather than trying to be everything for everyone, 4th edition honed the combat rules, especially, and in doing so, it was able to be extremely good at it. You got this really nice, deep, tactical combat system that 5th edition doesn't really go as far with. So, yeah, to an extent, I still prefer 4th edition.
So I think part of what's really I think part of the reason D&D 5th edition is so popular is not so much the D&D part, but the 5th edition. The fact that this is the fact that this is the 5th revision of it, the 5th, trying to streamline everything. They've worked so hard at getting out so many of the weird aspects, so many of the weird kinks, so that it is so refined, which it does make it one of the easiest tabletop games to get into, because they've had so many different revisions to make it kind of the best version of itself that it's trying to be.
I would argue that a much better starting point for a new player to tabletop RPGs is a game that is less complex.
Oh, absolutely. It really depends on the person who's playing it and the kind of game that they're looking for. But in terms of just for someone who doesn't really understand anything, they've heard so much about D&D, and then of course there's the 5th edition, and it was this is the 5th revision, this is the 5th version that we tried to make, this is the kind of the 5th overhaul, or the 4th overhaul, whatever you want to call it, however you want to count it. And it's this is the newest version, this is the polished version, this is the newest one that gives you the most shine.
Yeah, 5th edition does a lot of things right. I also have some design complaints about it. I don't really want to get into those here.
This isn't really a D&D podcast, of course.
Yeah, I just think that 4th edition did a lot of things really well, and it had its own problems, but they didn't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater there. 5th edition combines stuff from the earlier versions, but basically everything about 4th, even the really, really brilliant stuff, is just completely gone and ignored, largely because the reception to 4th edition by this extremely vocal but small group of players. These old grognards just hated how different it was because it completely overhauled everything. It was entirely different. And again, it was really good for what it was aiming to do, but they didn't like it. So there were a lot of really bad faith criticisms and arguments against it, and that was sort of the dominant narrative on the internet for many years. So, like, that was the vocal contingent that the designers for 5th edition really listened to. So, like, that's really my biggest gripe, just the fact that they were listening to this toxic portion of the player base to drive their design philosophy.
Which is true for a lot of games, which is why you get so many games that have a tacked-on multiplayer component, is because the people that want to play multiplayer are the ones that are most vocal about it. Whereas the people that want the single-player experiences with good stories, they're more introverted. They're not as willing to go on these forums and complain about this sort of thing. And if they do, they're beaten down by the other people. It's like, no, we're going to drop 80 lines of forum posts to say why you're wrong about that sort of thing.
I'm sorry, Eden, you've been very quiet.
Oh, I don't really have much else to say.
Fair enough.
Yeah, because I haven't played much of D&D itself. I mostly play indie games. So I don't have a lot to contribute regarding D&D in specific.
Oh yeah, that's a really good subject. If you like Dungeons & Dragons and you're listening to this, I highly encourage you to try other games. There is some really interesting stuff happening in tabletop RPGs these days, particularly, in the indie space. Like, I've been playing a Legacy Life Among the Ruins campaign with some friends and just having a blast. The GM of this group is Dana Lexa, who also plays Violence Violet on the award-winning actual play podcast Super Idols. Haha, shameless cross-promotion.
That is another important thing, though. If you do play a game like this, having a good GM is absolutely required. If you have somebody who doesn't understand, like, good storytelling, if someone, you really good GMs are the kind of people that are writers kind of in their own, like, not necessarily professionally, but ones that they write stories, they write fan fiction, they try to come up with ideas on their own. I think those are like the best people to get to GM these sort of things.
Yeah, and to clarify, I was not paid or even asked to say that. Dana is just really cool, and I wanted to give her a shout out. Also, the creator of Legacy, the game that I've been playing, is currently finishing up her newest game, Voidheart Symphony, which, if you're a fan of Persona 5, I highly recommend because it's basically that concept adapted as a tabletop RPG. I got to playtest an early version, and it is cool as heck. Again, this is not a paid promotion, I just think it's neat.
And I assure you, more than likely, if you have, like, specific things you want, there's a tabletop RPG system for that.
Absolutely. Like, everything D&D does, everything it doesn't do, there's a game for that. Like, I know the whole Apple, there's an app for that thing was, like, a joke, even while it was still their big ad campaign, but there really is a tabletop RPG for everything, even the most bizarrely specific niche things you can imagine. I am sure someone has done it. I mean, freaking Chubos is a thing. If Chubo's marvelous wish-granting engine exists, everything does.
I should go look for some dinosaur ones.
I guess that brings us to the end.
Yeah, there wasn't really much to talk about regarding this story of the last segment.
Yeah, I mean, all I really have to say is, Al Gore screaming about how the universe will be destroyed. As an environmentalist, I'm against that. I mean, I don't want the universe to end. The universe is where I keep all my stuff.
I want to save the galaxy because that's where I live.
An entirely valid reason.
Oh, just because you live there, now it suddenly becomes important.
I am important.
You are very important.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Space Podcast 3000. Your 3 voices of the future are Nova Altman, Doug Hancox, and Eden Valerie. The theme music is Voxel Revolution by Kevin MacLeod. You can hear more episodes of Space Podcast 3000 on YouTube or at soundcloud.com/SpacePod3K. You can support the show and listen to new episodes a full week early at patreon.com/SpacePod3K. Follow us on Twitter at SpacePod3K. Be sure to join us next time as the Planet Express crew join the military in War is the H Word.